Hello, it's halfway through 2025, so I wanted to tell you about the best and worst books that I have read so far this year. And we're going to run through them all and chat about why I loved them or why I hated them. Now, if you're new here, I kind of changed up my approach to reading this year for the first time in quite a while. For the past several years, I've set my reading goal at 100 and I've quite easily surpassed that. This year, I just was feeling a little bit overwhelmed and stressed out. And I was also just kind of wondering, am I reading because I want to or because there's a number kind of pressuring me to, and is that influencing the kinds of books that I'm choosing to prioritize? I don't know. I honestly wasn't sure. And that uncertainty kind of scared me a little bit. And so this year I decided to put my reading goal not at 100, not even at 10, but at one book. And I spoke about all of this in a video that I will leave a link to in the cards and in the description box below. And at the time of making that video back in January, I just really didn't know what my reading life was going to look like this year and how having such a small goal would impact me. Well, now we're past the halfway mark of 2025 and I guess I'm starting to find that out. Basically, I am still reading, but I'm definitely reading at a much slower pace. I think at this time I've read 30 books, give or take. So that's kind of roughly one a week. I'm not on track to even hit 100, let alone surpass it. So very, very different this year. And so I still am reading, but I'm definitely not reading at the same volumes. I think essentially what has happened is that reading has become one hobby in a list of many hobbies rather than being like my primary focus. Obviously in the last year or so, I've really gotten into birding, although I haven't been able to do that so much since my car accident, but that's been taking up plenty of my time across the year. I've also been getting into knitting since April, which has been so much fun and definitely something I'm spending a lot of time on. And then obviously I have another hobby, which is creative in a very different way, but also time consuming. YouTube. I was kind of worried at the beginning of the year that I would feel really sad that I wasn't reading as much, but instead I genuinely feel happier and I feel more enriched. Because obviously sometimes you go on a reading slump, and I think I used to have basically like an identity crisis when I was in a reading slump because like I'm a reader, I don't do anything else, and like what the fuck am I supposed to do with myself if I'm not reading? Who am I if I'm not reading? Having said that, it's not all sunshines and rainbows because obviously I'm also a bookseller. It does sort of feel tricky now if I've only read 30 books in the first half of the year to balance things like my book club that I host over on my Patreon, which is a book a month, with reading that I just want to do, like adult books that I want to do for myself, with reading children's books for work. So as a reader, I do feel less satisfied, even if I feel better as a human overall. I don't know. Weird, conflicting, messy, but real. That's how I feel. Anyway, I felt like that context was necessary, but without further ado, let's just dive right into the best and worst books so far of 2025. And I'm going to do what you're not supposed to do and tell you about my favorite book so far this year. I know I'm supposed to kind of leave it to the end and hope that you'll stick around and watch the whole video just so you can find out, but I'm just going to tell you because I want you to know about it. And I got a little sticky note up here on the top because I don't have it here physically because I listened to it on audiobook, and it is The River Has Roots. Now, this, like so many books that I have read this year and so many of the books that I'm going to talk about, I have spoken about in videos previously. So if you'd like to hear me wax lyrical about this book in full detail, please check the link in the description box below. I'll do my best to link any videos that are relevant where you can find out more about these books and my thoughts about them. And this is a very short book, so it's one that I don't want to talk about too much, especially in detail when it comes to the plot. It's just one of those books that I really think you should go into knowing as little as possible and just let you take it on a journey, because that's exactly what it did for me. So this comes from one of the authors who co-wrote This Is How You Lose the Time War, which is a book that I did really like, but I wouldn't say that I loved, and yet I loved this. It's essentially this like fairy tale, and when I say that I mean like the true old kind of fairy tales that feel both beautiful and whimsical and also kind of sinister. The kind of fairy tale that is exploring maybe darker themes, more complex themes, but with like this veneer of whimsy, that sort of thing. It's just lovely. It's truly beautiful, and it's really beautiful to read too. It's set in this kind of like Celtic sort of feeling world where there's this magic that's kind of just like intrinsic in the land, and it's called grammar. And so much of the magic is literally about grammar and wordplay and like riddles and all that sort of stuff. So we get a lot of that throughout the book, and it's just really fun to read. It's just very clever. On top of that, this is like a kind of a bit of a romance, and there's also like fairy or other kind of beings involved. And I know fairy romantasy is a huge thing at the moment, which I haven't really gotten into those kinds of books, but like this is the kind of fairy romance I can get into, my friends. Also, there's like this incredible sister relationship, which is genuinely like complex and interesting, but also like compelling and beautiful and touching. Like I said, I don't want to tell you too much about like the details and what the journey that you go on is. I just want to give you a few little morsels to chew on and to entice you, because I just think this book is beautiful. Genuinely, it made me emotional, sometimes from what was happening in the plot, but also other times just from how lovely it was to read. Do you ever just get emotional because words are beautiful? This book did that to me. It did. So all around, just like an absolute hit out of the park. I loved this book. It's definitely the kind of book that I would love to reread, re-listen to. I think it's the kind of thing that I'm probably going to return to in the same way that I found myself returning to Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. I mean, it's a completely different story, don't get me wrong, but there's just something about like a short story that is beautifully done, that has characters that you love, that's atmospheric, that has a world that feels rich, a world that feels like you're only getting a glimpse into it, you know, like it's not time wasted on explaining the unnecessary, and like that mystery is left to your imagination. The kind of story where your enjoyment doesn't hinge on the twist surprising you, but it's just about the experience overall. There's something about stories like that that just really draw me back time and time again, and I think this one is exactly that. Loved it, couldn't recommend it enough. So my favorite book so far this year. Now, the rest of these books, I have organized them. Of course I have, but they're not organized in like favorite to least favorite. Instead, I've got them organized into categories essentially. So let's just keep talking about my other favorite adult fiction books so far of 2025. And to be honest with you, there hasn't been a whole lot of them. I have read a decent amount of adult fiction so far this year, and I haven't really been loving most of what I've been reading. So you might be surprised to see Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell here at number 2. That is number 2 of my favorite like adult fiction reads of the year. So like categories within categories, okay? Now, this is a book that I read in a full reading vlog for you. That was actually the video where I was talking about my 1 book goal for 2025. So if you want to hear my in-depth, and I do go into detail with this one, if you want to hear my detailed thoughts, please watch that video, link in the description. I will just say that I loved so much about this, and I kind of just loved the experience of being in a book this long. Like that was a big element of my enjoyment, I'm not gonna lie, especially once I had removed the pressure of like needing to stick to a reading goal. This was the one book I had as a goal to read this year, and so I got to just enjoy it for what it was. I got to take my time with it, and I just got to be in it, and boy, are you in it for 1,000 pages. And in fact, this is the longest book I've ever read. Longest book I've ever read. Quite the achievement, no? Anyway, I loved quite a lot about this book. I loved the humor. Oh my God, that's my favorite part, especially in the first kind of section of this. This book is laugh out loud funny. Why did nobody tell me that this book is fucking hilarious? I don't know. I've just always seen this cover and figured it was like this dark kind of like academia, sort of like highbrow, taking itself very seriously kind of book. And it's just not. I mean, it kind of is. It kind of is highbrow. It's sort of like a pastiche of like historical novels like Dickens and Austen and stuff. At least to me, that's how it read. It felt like Susanna Clarke was writing a pastiche of these old classical novels. And yet she did it with this biting wit that was just, had me cackling. I'm not kidding you. Basically, this is like a low fantasy story about two magicians in this kind of like slightly alternative history, Victorian age England, in which magic is real. It does exist and it has existed throughout history, but there's been no magic in England for a long time. That is at least until Mr. Norrell shows up and is all like, actually, I can do magic and I'm very fancy and I want to help the English beat the French. Basically, it's a whole bunch of old white men politicking, but also there's a little bit of magic sprinkled in. And it's just fucking funny. It's really funny. You get so much detail, some might argue unnecessary, but it just felt so rich. There's footnotes, like it's just, there's so much here. And yet I ate it up, I truly did. Now, having said that, I didn't really like how it ended. There was one character in particular, which I do talk more about in that video. It's kind of spoilery, so I won't mention it here, but there was one character in particular that I just felt like was inserted and was ultimately used as nothing more than a plot device, which didn't sit well with me. And so I was left quite unsatisfied by the ending. But at the end of the day, I just had so much fun reading this. And the experience of really just allowing myself to take my time with such a big book and to be in it for so long was one of my favorite reading experiences so far of 2025. Next up, we have another sticky note to remind me of an audiobook, which is my third favorite adult fiction read of the year. And again, this is gonna come across as maybe a little unexpected, but it was Birding with Benefits. This is a book that I read, honestly, kind of low-key as a bit of a joke. I'm not gonna lie. Blair and I went away on a little birding holiday and I felt like reading about birding, but also I wanted to read a romance. And so my friend Tammy recommended this book and I went into it with pretty low expectations. I ate it up. Basically, it's a romance of kind of like fake dating in the birding world. And I especially love that our two protagonists were a little bit older. I think they were in their 40s from memory. They'd already kind of had long-term relationships that weren't necessarily healthy for them, and they'd gotten out of them. And so they'd come into this new fake dating, but there's sexual tension happening. They'd come into this kind of situationship with like experience, you know? They knew themselves and they knew what they wanted and what they needed. And it was just so fun. It was just so fun. I really liked their dynamic. Obviously the romance is front and center here, but the birding is a really integral part to this book. And the way that the author like wrote about birding just like captured the feeling that as I know it so perfectly. And so it was just literally the perfect thing to read on this little birding holiday that Blair and I went on in February. Again, I vlogged reading this, so I'll leave a link in the description box below. Okay, next up is a category I'm going to go over very quickly, but as a children's bookseller, I do have some favorite children's books so far this year. My favorite middle grade so far this year is Little Bones. This is a proof, so I'll put up the actual cover here for you. And this is actually a novel in verse, so a very quick read. I sat down, I think I read it in a sitting. I literally sobbed my eyes out by the end. This book moved me. Now, it is a little bit of a tricky hand sell because it's so emotional and it's dealing with some heavy topics. It is absolutely appropriate for like 10-year-olds, but that doesn't mean that it's always an easy sell, you know? Those two things don't always align. Anyway, in this book, we're introduced to a character who goes by the name Bones. Basically, we find out that Bones, her younger brother died about a year before this book starts. And she got this nickname because after his death, she kind of became obsessed with bones and collecting them. At the beginning of the book, she comes across basically like a full intact baby bird skeleton, and she takes it home and kind of cares for it. And then it comes to life. We also watch as she ends up making a friend, and there is just some like casual trans rep in this book, which is beautiful. So an incredible book about grief, about loss, but also about friendship and about love and compassion. Gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous. Then my favorite picture book of the year so far is A Map for Palestine. This is another one that I have spoken about a little bit. Basically at this one we meet Palestine, who's a little girl going to like preschool or something in America, but her family's from Palestine. And one day when the preschool teacher kind of rolls out a map of the world and asks everybody, where's your family from? Find them on the map, show us. And Palestine's there looking and she can't find Palestine. She cannot find Palestine on the map. And so she goes home and she asks like each person in her family in turn, like, why isn't Palestine on the map? And her grandfather, her mother, her grandmother, all of them have like a little bit of a different answer or a different response and a way of dealing with this. And it's just incredible. At the back of this, there's also a whole bunch of information for adults, kind of providing some context, but also some helpful tips for talking about Palestine with younger children. I think this will be an incredible book for Palestinians living in the diaspora who are having like similar questions coming up with their kids. But I think it's also a great book for kids who are not Palestinian across the world who are also asking some questions or wanting to know more. And for parents who want a way in, I think books can be a wonderful kind of window into talking about harder topics and finding ways to be honest about those topics while still being like child appropriate and age appropriate. Highly recommend. Next up, we have my favorite graphic novel of the year so far, and this is Into the Bewilderness by Gus Gordon. This is marketed as a children's book. We sell it at work, but I feel like it's one of those books that I'm sure children would like, but there's something about the humor that I think is absolutely appropriate, maybe even targeted towards adults too. Basically, we're introduced to these two little friends, Pablo and Luis, who are this like big bear and this tiny little mole. And they're just very unlikely friends. One is like really sweet and simple and just like very optimistic. And the other is like a grouchy little couch potato. And they're living a very slow, sweet little life in the forest when one day one of them wins tickets to like a show in the big city. But I mean, this isn't really about the plot. Like stuff happens, but it's not really about the plot. Instead, it's more like these little chapters are like little life lessons, but told in humorous ways. It's just adorable. It's so adorable, but it's also funny. I loved it. Okay, now we're on to my favorite non-fiction reads so far, 2025. And this is the last category of favorites before we get to the books that I'm about to shit on. So enjoy the positivity while it lasts. My absolute favorite non-fiction read so far of 2025 is The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This was recently a book that I read with my book club over on my Patreon. And I did do like a full-length detailed reading vlog for them over on Patreon. I don't know that I would call this one of my favorite non-fiction books of all time, although to be fair, the bar for that list is very high. But I did just love reading it. and I thought it was really powerful and effectively done. Basically, in this book, we have 4 different essays, although I'd say that the 3 main ones essentially follow Ta-Nehisi Coates, the author, as he travels to 3 different places. The first is to Senegal, the second is to South Carolina, and the third is to Palestine. And basically, in each of these 3 places, he's talking about his experience, he's exploring a whole host of different topics and themes that are coming up, but ultimately this book comes back to, I think, some really central themes and the way that he threads them throughout these 3 different locations without it feeling repetitive. The way that he builds on them, I think, is just really, really well done. In all 3 places, he's definitely talking a lot about race and history and stories. The ways that we individually, but also societally, construct narratives and mythologies around different topics to either challenge or to reinforce status quo. And so the way that he explores like the slave trade in the first chapter, book banning and censorship in the second, and then apartheid, colonialism, and genocide in the third, just really, really powerful stuff. And he talks about quite a lot the power of writing and the purpose of writing, which he posits is to shed light and to illuminate topics, to hopefully seek truth. And it feels like that's genuinely what he's attempting to do here, to unravel those mythologies, those narratives, to get to the truth, the moral and ethical heart of an issue, you know? And the way that he did all of that in like a relatively short volume, I thought was impeccably done. So definitely my favorite nonfiction so far in 2025. Another nonfiction that I read with my book club was How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective. Now this is like a collection of interviews and essays with a whole host of people who were involved in the Combahee River Collective. And it's pretty short. It is something that like physically you could sit down and read in like a day, but I would suggest taking your time with this one. The Combahee River Collective is something that I'd like heard of vaguely before, but it's not something I knew a whole lot about. And so getting to hear these different people's perspectives on activism and like community building and what has and hasn't been effective and why, I think is just so useful, both like practically, but also just like emotionally. I think especially when we find ourselves in really dire times, as we all know, it can feel like we're starting from scratch in so many ways, or like that we have to build from nothing. And like, what do we do? Like, there's no blueprint for what we do. And that's not to say that all of the strategies from the past can be copy pasted to our current circumstances, but I think there is so much to learn from activists throughout history. And I think it can be so powerful to be reminded that people have been working at this shit for so long. And yes, there have been failures, there have been losses, but there have also been wins and successes. And I think being reminded of that is just so important. And so I really just enjoyed this, like all of these different people's voices and perspectives I valued so much, but there was also just something about spending some time with people who have been here and done this shit before, you know? Really good, highly recommend. And then my third favorite nonfiction that I have read so far this year is Conversations with Birds. Now, I was primarily listening to this on audiobook, although I did dive in and out of the book sometimes too. And it's a book that I listened to over the span of months. I took my time reading this because basically this is one of those books that's sort of like a memoir, interconnected essays kind of vibe, but with a central theme, which is birds. So basically Priyanka Kumar takes us through different points in time in her life and kind of talks about that experience or that moment, but through the lens of a particular bird that she was watching or spending time with at that same time, if that makes sense. And so some of these essays feel much more like memoir based, whereas others, especially towards the end of the book, the further along we get, feel much more about the bird and the environment and her kind of quest to understand how all of these things are interconnected and what's at risk with climate crisis. So it's tackling and juggling a whole lot of different things, but I think kind of just like diving in and out of this book, dipping in and out over a long period of time, definitely just was like a really enjoyable way to experience this book. There were definitely elements of this book that was hard to read and that were emotional, especially when she's talking about, you know, the massive reduction in birds over the last 10, 20, 50, 100, even like the last 5 years. It's often just really hard to read and really miserable to read, but a lot of the time this book was also just really beautiful and tender too. And I think she balanced all of that really well. So I just loved reading this book and I'm so glad that I did. Okay, and with that, we've had enough positivity. It's time to get mean and grumpy. And talk about the books that I hated so far this year. Although maybe that's a little strong, especially for this first one. This is more my most disappointing read so far this year, if I'm going to be honest with you. It is the 5th installment in one of my favorite fantasy series ever, The Singing Hill Cycle by Nevo. This book, The Brides of High Hill. I did talk about this in a reading vlog, again, link in the description. And it is also a very short book. And it's also, like I said, the 5th in a series. So there's only so much I can tell you. But what I will say is that this was just I don't think it was a terrible book, but given the caliber of the rest of the series and just how damn good this series is and how much Nevo has managed to pack into these tiny little volumes. Like in the previous 4, I often come away just being like, oh my God, this world, this story is so rich. How have they done it in 100 pages? That's just wild. Whereas this one, it's still so short and yet it dragged. And I think primarily that is because unlike the other books, which are complex and layered and intricate, this one was just very straightforward and linear, superficial. It just did not have any kind of like spark to it. Like, yeah, there was a little bit of a twist, but I don't come to this looking for like a gothic thriller. I come to this series because I want character work done in this really rich, complex world that feels so much bigger than I can even grasp. This book did none of that. It almost felt like, yes, there was characters with the same names that I'm used to and that I know well, but it just felt like a completely different story. Like if you had to change the names of these characters, I would have thought it was written by a different author. I wouldn't have thought it was connected to the Singing Hill cycle at all. It just felt so out of place and so lackluster. And given my love for this series, I think that's why this disappointment hurts enough for me to put it on my least favorite, the third least favorite book so far of 2025. My second least favorite book so far of 2025, you will have heard me talk all about recently. It is, of course, Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V.E. Schwab. I do sort of feel like I had this coming, given that Addie LaRue, which is the only other book that I've read from by this author, I put on my least favorite books of 2024. There's a pattern here, Katey. Like, arguably this was predictable. However, as you'll know, I should have loved Addie LaRue, and in so many ways, I loved a lot of what Addie LaRue had to offer. I just hated Addie herself, and I hate the journey that we went on, and I hate the ending. But because I loved the feeling of that book, the wistfulness, the atmosphere, I really wanted to give V.E. Schwab one more chance. And so I picked up her latest release, which is about sapphic vampires. And I was excited. I'm not going to lie. I was excited and I was optimistic. And yet what I found was so dull. Just dull. Like sapphic vampires, I didn't think that could be boring. I didn't think it was possible. And yet somehow V.E. Schwab managed it. Don't ask me how. To me, this book is very similar to Addie LaRue in so many ways, but unfortunately in all the worst ways. It's superficial as hell. There's so much pretense to like subtext and complexity that just does not pay off. It's way too long for what it is. And I also don't think the timelines and the way that we learnt about different things, the order that we learnt about them, I don't think that was done to optimal effect either. Also, there is so much not like other girl bullshit happening here. You know what I mean? Like it's pretending to be a feminist novel, and yet I'm not convinced that V.E. Schwab likes women. I mean, maybe that's going a little bit too hard, but like the feminism here that this book is attempting is superficial as hell. And even like the parallels and allegories for queerness and liberation and coming out and like a queer experience, all of that felt really hollow too. There were definitely elements that worked, but as a book, it didn't. I genuinely think that if this had been a novella or even a short story, it definitely had the potential to be really punchy, really intense, harrowing, powerful, all of those sort of things. But instead, it is just a bloated mess. And I, for one, will not be drinking the V.E. Schwab Kool-Aid again anytime soon. Okay, but with that out of the way, we have my least favorite book so far of 2025, and you haven't heard me talk about it yet. So this is a complete surprise. Isn't that fun? However, I'm not going to tell you about it right now because I read this book. I was starting to do a reading vlog. I had intentions of reading the entire series sort of thing by this author. And I started out with this book and I hated it so much that I never filmed anything else for the video. And this hurts. This truly hurts because that book is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. Now, I went into this book with such high expectations. I really did, because Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel has been one of my favorite books of the last few years. I loved it. I think 2023, it was my third favorite book of the year. Just incredible. And so I promptly bought the other two books in this kind of like vaguely connected series of books that she has, with the plan to read all three in the correct order in a reading vlog for you. And I genuinely thought I was about to discover two new favorite books, and I genuinely thought that video would basically be me just like gushing about finding a new favorite author. And instead I got this absolute bullshit. Are you kidding me? Honestly, this is one of those books that I know so many people on BookTube love. It's like a BookTube favorite, and I'm just here being like, what? BookTube, you have some explaining to do. I truly don't want to be a hater. Like, that is not what I come to make these videos for, I promise. And yet I am somebody who feels my feelings very intensely, and I am not good at lying about them. But anyway, it has been like months since I read this book, and like I said, I was filming a reading vlog for you of like, I started filming. I did my little review for this, and then I never filmed anything more. So instead, I'm just gonna let past Katey take it away and give you my initial reaction from when I first read this book. I finished Station 11, and after all that hyping up I did in the intro about how much I loved Sea of Tranquility and how convinced I was that I was going to love every single one of these books, I'm gonna have to eat my words, because I have been truly humbled, because I didn't like this book. So I did finish it, I didn't DNF it, and I liked reading it well enough, you know, like I think there's just something about Emily St. John Mandel's writing in particular that just really works for me. Like, I really, really love her writing, and I love the tone. Like, this has a kind of similar tone to Sea of Tranquility in that it's wistful, and that is just about my favorite tone for a book to have. Anyway, before we get into specifics, this book basically follows the collapse of the world as we know it following a global pandemic. Now, it is important to note that this book was written and published well before our recent COVID pandemic. This was published in 2014, I think. And so, to be so fair to the book, a lot of things that didn't work for me about this book, I'm sure probably would have worked had we not just been through a pandemic of our own. You know, I just feel like there's so many things that we all learned about, like how pathogens work and how viruses spread, and also just like about like how humans respond to catastrophe. I feel like we have all learned so much more about all of those things since 2020. And so there's just a lot about this book that, at least for me, didn't really hold up, like was beyond believable, I guess. And we watch as this virus, this pandemic, very, very quickly takes over the world and completely changes everything. And we kind of witness elements of that collapse, but then we're also seeing people kind of like 10, 15, 20 years after the collapse, and like what is left of humanity, what people are up to, how they're functioning, what kind of society still exists. And I think honestly, it's just things like the way that this virus, you catch it like instantly, you're sick within hours and you're dead within 48 hours of getting sick. And it's got something like a 99% mortality rate. So at the beginning of the book, as we're watching this pandemic kind of come to, I think it's Ontario, just like how quickly everything changes and collapses and how quickly people are just like dropping dead, literally. And obviously I am no epidemiologist. I don't want to tell you what is and isn't possible when it comes to viruses and pandemics, but I feel like something that a lot of us normies learned through our own pandemic is that COVID, for example, spread worldwide as successfully as it did because yes, it was deadly and is deadly, but it doesn't have that kind of mortality rate. And also it has quite a long incubation period, giving it a chance to actually spread. Whereas in the case of the flu in this book, things just spread so quickly and everybody just fucking dies. Like we're talking about how there was rumblings of a virus in Georgia, like the country in Europe. And within a matter of like a day or two later, it's in Ontario and civilization is collapsing around us, you know? So I think that is one of the reasons that it was a little bit hard to just like suspend my disbelief and like sink into this. And I think if that was my only issue with the book, I could have forgiven it. But the other thing is that civilization collapses so completely, and yet there's no like significant complications or fallout from like, I don't know, like the nuclear power plants we have all over the place, you know? How like those reactors need to be kept cool, and if they're not kept cool and like maintained in a very specific way, like it's just catastrophic what happens, and the contamination that would happen to the environment on like a mass level if that were to happen. And that is just one example, right? So the idea that there was just like no fallout from civilization collapsing just again made no sense to me. But I think that ties into one of my more like ethical problems with this book. And that is that although it is dealing with the tragedy of so much death, like mass death, and it does kind of talk a little bit about some of the trauma and difficulties that the people who have survived have been through. And even though a lot of these characters do look back to our current world somewhat fondly, different aspects of it are romanticized. Ultimately, though, this new world, I feel like this new post-civilization world is the one that the book is romanticizing a whole lot more. And like, I am as mad and scared about the current state of the world as the next person, but there's just something a little bit icky to me in romanticizing 99% of the population dying, especially when there is one character in this book who we meet kind of like as the pandemic is taking over, who is a disabled character. And the way that the book handles that person in this book, yikes. Yikes, yikes, yikes is all I've got to say. I don't know, I could go on. There are a few other kind of like points of pain for me throughout this book, but I feel like in order to explain them to you, I'd have to go into way too many details. So just know that, like I said, I love Emily St. John Mandel's writing. I love the tone of this whole book. And so even though I wasn't vibing with the plot, with the characters, I wasn't really vibing with her messaging, I found it enjoyable enough to read. But now that I finished reading it and I'm out of it and I have to actually like think about what I read, I really don't like it. Okay, so there we have it. Those are all the reasons, well, some of the reasons. Like I said, there are more why I hated Station 11. How disappointing. But anyway, before I devolve into an existential crisis, I wanted to say a big thank you to my lovely patrons over on Patreon, and especially a big thank you to Livia, Haley, and Belinda for their support over on Patreon, and for everybody over there, and for you for watching all the way to the end. I would love to hear in the comments below what your favorite and least favorite book so far of 2025 has been. How's your reading year going? Let me know. And until next week, happy reading and so much love. Bye.